Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast, where your hosts go deep undercover into the world of spy movies to decipher which films make the knock list. But remember, this information is strictly for your ears only. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur. And Scott, I was thinking, we should go out and hit the town.
We should. You should put some sort of, clothing around your neck.
Well, yeah, we'll have some grub, then march to the Palladium, best row 4, with the proper pincer movement.
Well, we love pincer movements here on Spy Hards, temporal or otherwise.
What the hell did that sentence mean when that guy said it? I went back and rewound it like 3 times and put on the subtitles, and I was like, I still don't understand what this man is saying.
I'm pretty sure he was just talking gibberish because he was excited to be out with a pretty lady.
Oh, is that it? Because when you're talking about pincer movements, is that a common first date line? Should I be dropping the pincer movement into conversation?
Well, the fact that you're still dating says that you haven't yet.
Very true. That's when you put the ring on the finger, the pincer movement.
That's what we call it here. So I'm not getting down on one knee. I'm doing the pincer movement.
Excuse me. I just need to get down on one knee and perform the pincer movement.
Every British person's like, yes.
They're pulling out Kleenex. They're like, this is the most romantic thing I've ever seen.
Get ready. He's going to pinch her. We're on fire, folks. We're on fire.
There's like a YouTube, like a compilation clip, like most romantic pincer movements.
That's getting to the naughty level now, I think. A romantic pincer movement. That's something that happens between 2 consenting or more adults.
Right.
Enough said about that, the better, although we may go back to pincer movements. But, it's interesting times here on Spy Hard's podcast. We've been riding a high recently. We've had the Sean Connery Roundtable, Luciano Paluzzi, massive coverage of Courier, allied as well with the Really 007 team, and VJ Armitage just recently on the show as well. And Cam, all that momentum thrusting us forward into the podcasting world. What are we doing with it?
Well, we are going to bring in some glitz and glamour of old Hollywood and tackle the 1954 romantic spy drama Betrayed, starring Clark Gable, Lana Turner, and Victor Mature.
I couldn't think of a more Spy Hard's way of building off of that momentum.
Well, I suppose in terms of popularity, one does not equal the others, but we got the big star power here. So that kind of lines up well with something like Allied, which in some ways is paying tribute to movies like this. Not necessarily this movie, but movies like this.
No, that's true. And I always say, this is the Spy Hard special we're doing here. We're pulling a film out of the spy movie archives and putting it into the light, bringing it into the light, for to use spy parlance. And I was thinking about this when I was writing my notes. We really are the sommeliers of spy movies.
Wait.
We put our nose deeply into the wine glass and breathe in the heady aromas of spy movies to give you the wine list, the knock list, you see. I'm making this metaphor very strained.
Well, initially when you said sommelier, I immediately thought of F. Murray Abraham and Amadeus, and I was like, wait, who's the genius we're killing?
That's for another day.
Right, okay, fair enough. I understand what you mean, yes. We are kind of the connoisseurs of the obscure.
And I think it benefits us. I've always said these films inform our discussions on the bigger ones.
Yeah, and often, we stumble across these ones that some of them were box office duds and ended a trend. And so then we kind of get to mark the end of something that was very popular for a period of time and then went away.
I wonder what will end our trend.
Boss Baby 2.
Lord knows they've been trying.
I think there's a third one on the way, right?
Please stop.
Yeah, no kidding. I don't want to cover 3 of those.
Is the second S in boss turned into a 3 by any chance?
No, at this point it's just dollar signs for the S's.
Yeah. Okay, that does make a lot of sense. But we're not going to get into full depression mode and talk about Baby just yet. Clark Gable is on our radar, and I can't wait to talk about this film. And there is actually a lot to talk about here. But before we get deep into Betrayed, here is your letterbox synopsis. And Cam, this is the first time in a long time we have a ... more.
Oh, beautiful. Although I can kind of see why a little bit with this one.
I can see why it is a bit. It's a rich text.
It's a text.
It's a big text. It's War and Peace. Okay, well here we go, folks. Betrayed. MGM filmed the mystery of the year in Holland.
Mystery of the year. That would be interesting. I mean, I do not plan to do this, but to do like a deep dive of the movies of 1954 and see if there was like a like classic mystery movie that came out that year that that looks a little ridiculous to make that claim.
Well, I'd have to sort of look it up against other spy films that came out in this year. I think the only one that springs to mind.
There's not many.
Well, on our list, Cam, the only one is actually this.
No, that's true. I mean, it seems like we've tackled a number from 1952, but 1954, not really a thing. And I was just quickly looking up. Well, hold the phone. Call the correction police.
Oh,
Mystery of the year. This came out the same year as Rear Window from Alfred Hitchcock. I would say that was a little more of a fulfilling mystery.
I think they were going for
Delusion?
Attitude. Well, attitude determines altitude, as the saying goes. If you say you're the best mystery of the year, you might just be it.
Man, that's embarrassing coming out the same year as Rear Window. Just saying.
They did not plan that.
No, they did not. They did not see that coming.
I mean, it's one of those situations where I guess someone like saw the poster and thought, oh, maybe this is the best mystery of the year, and hadn't seen Rear Window. That's what they're counting on here.
Sure, I don't know release dates, but either way, the same year, that's a little embarrassing.
Well, anyway, here is the synopsis. Screen superstar Clark Gable, gone with the wind, and it happened one night, and sultry bombshell Lana Turner, Peyton Place, and the postman always rings twice, team up in this intriguing World War II drama. Suspected of being a Nazi spy, Dutch resistance member Turner is given a last chance mission to redeem herself. Gable is an intelligence agent of the exiled Dutch government who falls in love with her. Co-starring Victor Mature, My Darling Clementine, ... more. We haven't really got anywhere with the plot particularly just yet, so I'm really interested to see what the ... more has for us.
Is it another credit for Victor Mature?
No, it's literally just one extra line.
Oh.
I'll read you the whole line now. I've seen the rest of it. Co-starring Victor Mature, My Darling Clementine, and Oscar nominee Louis Calhern, The Asphalt Jungle.
Okay, so it's more like promoting the big stars and their illustrious credits than the plot of the movie.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense actually when you look at it, because I think this really is. I mean, the poster itself is almost 1/3 their names.
I'll just summarize it for people who maybe don't quite follow what that synopsis is selling. It's Notorious, set in World War II in Holland.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. One of my notes is Notorious meets Black Book.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
No, that could be a great thing. A great thing.
It could be. It could be.
Could be.
But let's get down to it. Gable's first time on the show.
Yeah. I mean, he didn't make a lot of spy films, but there are a couple, I think, on our master list. But he did not make one that was like a classic of the genre.
Okay. Well, maybe this is it.
Well, maybe it is, but outside of this one, he did not have a spy who came in from the cold, for example, or something like that.
Sure. Okay. Well, I doubt either of us have ever watched this film before. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, no. I mean, I've seen a number of films from the stars of this movie, but Betrayed is one that the fact that we're calling it a Spy Hard special kind of indicates that it has not held a lot of kind of a reputation in the many years going forward.
No, and it's I mean, it's at least MGM have preserved the film.
Yeah.
You can actually still catch it online and rent it and things like that. Because,
everywhere.
Yeah, it's not like it's one of those 50s films that's ended up on YouTube.
No, that really bums me out. I mean, I don't mind if they're on YouTube because it makes it easy for us, but the number of movies we have on our master list that have some of them legit stars, came from major studios, that are just really hard to watch now.
Yeah, because they don't think there's enough reason to put them into an archive somewhere or anything like that. They just exist somewhere.
Yeah, they're in the vaults somewhere, and they're yep, no one cares, whatever.
Well, we'll tackle that when we get to it, but at least Betrayed is here. So I'm quite curious to hear from you, Cam, because I don't know much about the stars of this film or its genesis. So could you take us through the behind the scenes of Betrayed?
Okay, so this started as a screenplay, obviously, and I'll give a little bit of context for the writers on this movie. So let's start with George Froschel, who was an Austrian screenwriter whose name I probably just butchered, but he was working in the German film industry in the early 20s and crossed over into America basically after the start of World War II with the 1940 Vivien Leigh World War II love story Waterloo Bridge. Vivien Leigh, of course, the co-star of Clark Gable 1 year earlier in Gone with the Wind.
Okay.
So she's on the top of the world. George Froschel is working with her in 1940. And then in 1942, he co-wrote Mrs. Miniver, which was a British family drama set during World War II and was like this great, like, kind of film that people celebrate because it gave them a lot of hope and aspirations in tough times during World War II. And that movie was an Oscar juggernaut. It won 6 Oscars, including Best Picture and Screenplay, which Froschel got to share because there was 3 writers on the film.
Mm-hmm.
And his career began to really take off. So after Mrs. Miniver, he wrote the very next year Random Harvest, which was another Academy Award nominee for Best Picture, and that's a film with Ronald Colman and Greer Garson.
Mm-hmm.
And so this guy is like in a very good place. 1948, he writes a Clark Gable war drama called Command Decision. So he's worked with Clark Gable. And it was actually in the year 1950 that there is a crossover here. So in 1950, he writes a sequel or co-writes a sequel to Mrs. Miniver called The Miniver Story. That script was co-written by Ronald Miller, the co-writer of this film. And so this is the first time these two men cross paths. And Ronald Miller, little bit of a different background. He's an English writer who began in the 1940s acting in bit parts, including a tiny little role in the Powell and Pressburger 1943 classic, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. And if you'll remember, Powell and Pressburger created The Spy in Black, which we covered on the show.
I do fondly remember The Spy in Black and its admiration for butter.
That's right. And Ronald Miller also, in 1947, basically crossed into writing, for leaving kind of this bit acting behind, with a 1947 wartime drama called Frida, starring Glynis Johns, who was the mother, of course, in Mary Poppins.
Of course.
We've talked about her a couple times. She was like a young girl that got like thrown out a window in a movie we watched.
Yeah, wasn't that the Spanish Civil War spy film, like Counterfeit Agent or something like that?
No, it wasn't, because that was the one we compared the moment with Glynis Johns to. We were like, this reminds us a lot of that movie.
So it was a more recent one. I'll look back through our recent episodes and I'll see if it triggers something in my mind.
Right. So at this point, Ronald Miller, shortly after Frida, collaborates with George Froschel on writing the Miniver Story, and the two men begin to work together quite a bit. They did the 1952 swashbuckler Scaramouche, starring Stuart Granger, which was a hit. They also co-wrote the Clark Gable romantic drama Never Let Me Go in 1953, and this movie, Betrayed, was their follow-up to a movie that I need to track down. It's the 1954 Mountie musical Rosemarie, about the the Canadian Mounted Police, and it's a musical.
You've never felt so at home than in that film.
Rosemarie, I mean, that's a perhaps a Spy Hard's Agents in the Field episode or something. Who knows?
I can hear them all flocking to Patreon right now.
And so Betrayed actually marked their final collaboration. This was the last time these two writers worked together. Miller would go off and work in TV primarily, and Froschel would write 4 more feature films before retiring in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was like interesting that this has happened before, where we've had two writers who at a certain point just kind of like merge and work together for a stretch of years. But this was one where it was like two guys writing like pretty major star vehicles together for a short period of time.
So they're the kind of like go-to hands for 5 to 10 years, basically.
Yeah.
For MGM.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Good place to be.
Oh, look where we are. we
Uh,
we aspire to go to the guns for hire at MGM.
I mean, MGM is not in the best of straits anymore, I guess, but I think I would still take being their gun for hire. Hey, if someone wants to pay me to write a new Mountie musical, I'll do it.
You and I would probably wind up as production assistants on 007 Road to a Million Season 2.
We would be getting Mr. and Mrs. Whoever from Scunthorpe Coffee.
Oh, we can dream. We can dream.
Mm-hmm. And no, folks, Mr. and Mrs. Scunthorpe Coffee was not their surname.
And so this movie was inspired by the 1944 World War II mission Operation Market Garden.
Yeah.
And of course, if that rings a bell, that was the mission that brought to life the movie A Bridge Too Far, which chronicled that in detail. I have to be honest, when this movie was over, I was like, really? I mean, I don't know if there was that much information about Operation Market Garden that I was really gleaning from this film.
Well, what I find more interesting is that this one of the characters I'm sure we'll talk about. We sort of casually mentioned the scarf already. Is actually based on a real life spy, and his actions you could kind of trace to leading up and causing the East-West divide in Berlin.
Yeah. I like this movie has some interesting DNA.
Yeah. If anyone wants me to explain that later in the episode, I'm more than happy to. But yeah, it's
Please.
Well, I can do it now for sure. He the person it's based on, he was a double agent, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, and ended up stalling the British advance. And so the Russians got further along, and they were able to make it to Berlin when the Western forces also made it to Berlin. And that's basically them getting their foothold in Berlin is the beginning of how then communism took over Russia, and then you get that East-West divide.
Wow. Did he wear a scarf?
Who? Stalin?
No, the guy that this was loosely based on.
I don't know about that actually, but he is quite a well documented. I'll see if I can find a name during the chat. He is out there. I actually should just go to the trivia because I was reading it earlier. But yeah, like it is a pretty famous spy saboteur, we should say, from Denmark. Yeah, here we go. So it's based on the story of Dutch resistance leader and double agent Christian Antonius Lindemans. Lindemans was a Dutch double agent during World War II, working under Soviet control. He was blamed for betraying Operation Market Garden, which you mentioned, and as a result helped the Germans win the Battle of Arnhem in 1944. The loss of this battle prolonged the war for 6 months and allowed the Red Army to enter Berlin first, which you then could chart as them getting a foothold in Berlin. And we end up with 40 years of a divide.
Yeah, and I guess inadvertently kicks off a entire streak of spy movies.
Yeah, so Cold War fans, Bridge of Spies fans out there, you have this guy to thank. Lindemans is your hero. That's loose.
I suppose.
I guess.
Yeah.
Your catalyst. He's your catalyst.
There we go. That's probably the best term. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I just found that interesting that this film that's forgotten about has this bit of history tied into it.
Yeah. So let's move on and talk a bit about the director, Gottfried Reinhardt, who was a German director and producer, and he was the son of the famed theater director Max Reinhardt. And his initial kind of move into Hollywood was actually as a writer. He was not a long-term writer, but in 1935, he had a story credit on the Joan Crawford film I Live My Life, and then wrote or had story credits on a couple other star vehicles for Louise Rayner and Annabella. But it was actually in 1940 where he kind of makes more of his power move, if you will, where he writes and produces the 1940 romantic spy film, Comrade X, starring Clark Gable and Hedy Lamarr.
Oh, what a pairing.
That film is on our master list to cover at some point. It's not necessarily the best remembered, but it was at the time kind of one of those earlier kind of Cold War films.
And that was, of course, your username on ICQ back in the day.
It was Comrade X. Yeah, that was me. Camrad X.
It was Camrad. Yeah. Cha-ching. Hey.
Money in the bank.
Unlike Betrayed.
Yeah. So Reinhardt was a producer for about a decade after after his kind of writing credits. So that was his main focus, was producing. But in 1952, he moved into directing and assumed, the big chair, and oversaw a film called The Invitation, starring Van Johnson. And I looked up the film. It's about a millionaire buying his dying daughter a husband. So kind of a romantic, weepy kind of film. And then directed some segments for a 1953 anthology called The Story of Three Loves, and that led right into Betrayed. He did not have the most auspicious directing career. His most notable works, and he did bounce actually between a lot of West German filmmaking and TV and also American films. So he did a German remake of Grand Hotel, which was an Oscar-winning film from the 1930s. He did it in 1959. He also did a film that was very acclaimed called Town Without Pity in 1961 that was a very kind of dark courtroom drama starring Kirk Douglas, who had to basically defend 4 soldiers who were accused of sexual assault against a young woman. And I have not seen this film, but I was just reading about it online. I think I'm going to track it down because it sounds like it's quite a compelling and it's definitely cult following as a film that's remembered as quite intense and compelling.
Okay. Well, it's always nice when these films, open up new avenues for you in your viewing list, because your list of films to be viewed is extensive.
Right. Exactly. Yes. And that sort of kind of speaks to what his directing career. He really, by the end, was just directing films in Germany. He went back there and just worked mostly for the rest of his career. Now, in terms of the casting, this movie went through a few different permutations of the actors in the leads and whatever. Originally, Gregory Peck was who they wanted to star in this film. And it says on Wikipedia, Kirk Douglas. I could find no verifiable information about Kirk Douglas being up for this movie. Gregory Peck was the name that came up again and again. So I'm not sure where that kind of came from, and I don't trust Wikipedia.
I have some things I want to talk about when it comes to Clark Gable in this film. So I'm just trying to picture what a 1954 Gregory Peck looks like. And I have to hope he's more invested than the 1967 The Chairman Gregory Peck.
He would have been young, too. And that's a big contrast to me, like a younger Gregory Peck versus 53-year-old Clark Gable.
Because one of the things this film hinges on is this, Clark Gable character as a seasoned spy. And he has quite a high rank in the military, but also there's quite a high mortality rate in the 1940s, early 1940s, especially if you're in the Dutch army.
Yeah.
So a young commander isn't that outrageous.
No. I think that would have been an interesting alternate version of this film. Mm-hmm. They were also looking at Richard Widmark to play the Scarf, and Richard Widmark was one of those character actors that was so great, especially in film noirs, because he always had this rough and tumble kind of vibe to him. And then Ava Gardner was up for the female lead before Lana Turner won it over. And the original title was actually going to be The True and the Brave, which is interesting because there's a movie with Kirk Douglas and Lana Turner made a handful of years earlier called The Bad and the Beautiful. And it's almost like when you have Lana Turner having a title that's, The True and the Brave, it almost evokes memories of a masterpiece, which is The Bad and the Beautiful.
It's the cinematic universe.
It is, yes. We need to come up with more of those.
Beauty and the Beast.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a great one.
Let us know, folks. What other films are in the and the CU?
What was it? Beautician and the Beast with Fran Drescher?
Well, that's a real reach. Also, you get no points for that because I came up with a whole new title and you just added one word.
Well, mine has a Bond connection because Timothy Dalton was the co-lead of Beautician and the Beast.
I'm not sure you're allowed to get away with that one, Cam.
Now that might be an Agents in the Field.
Oh God, I could hear someone trying to hack into our Patreon to shut it down at this point.
No, I don't think that would necessarily be that appealing to anyone. I don't even know if that movie ever got a DVD release. I feel like it's just forgotten to the sands of 1997.
It truly is the Beast.
It is indeed. And so this movie had the most extensive use of Dutch locations in a Hollywood movie ever at the time of shooting. I don't know if it's been beaten, honestly. I'd have to dig into that one, but I did notice that in this movie. It really, a lot of 1950s movies are very stage bound, and this one really made great use of its locations.
Yeah, you actually felt like you were there, which is the critical thing because a lot of stuff could just be shot on a backlot somewhere in those days.
Well, when we talked about The Man Who Knew Too Much, the remake version with Jimmy Stewart,
Hmm.
like they did shoot in Morocco, but there was a lot of it that was clearly not.
Like backplate stuff that's just them cut in. Yeah.
Yeah, and like there is an atmosphere that comes like in this movie from actually shooting in Holland.
I mean, it didn't fail to get a laugh out of me watching the scarf on top of like the building, rousing the people of Holland. I think they were in Amsterdam. They may not have been.
Yeah,
And like that was literally a crowd of about 500 people. They
yeah,
just got in as extras. I guess just lived in that town. They were like, "Yeah, I'll be in a film."
that's what you and I can aspire to, being in a crowd scene one day.
The backs of our heads.
Exactly. Yes.
The very indistinguishable backs of our heads.
Like the Hitchcock cameo in Man Who Knew Too Much.
Yeah, sure. I mean, people are looking out for Hitchcock cameos, though. People are not looking out for the back of my head.
No, that's true. That's very true. And so this movie, the cinematographer on this movie is a very celebrated figure, Freddie Young, who we talked about because he was the one that shot The Deadly Affair with James Mason.
Okay.
But he had worked on Lawrence of Arabia, or he would go on to work on Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago. He'd also did You Only Live Twice and Goodbye, Mr. Chips, and a whole other string of classic films. This was about the best in the business lensing this movie.
Which adds up in the sense of why I always think You Only Live Twice is one of the better looking Connery films.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely really knows how to shoot the locations of You Only
Yeah.
Live Twice. Yeah, definitely. And then also, of course, that big volcano sequence.
Yeah. It's. I think it's for me probably the best looking of Connery's films.
I think Thunderball looks pretty fantastic.
Yeah, they do capture that sort of Bahamian spirit. I'll give you that.
Like you can say that the underwater scenes go on too long, but they look incredible.
Yeah, I think I have to kind of like those scenes to agree with you, but I can kind of take that hat off and just be like, yeah, at the time it probably looked great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And this film marked the fourth and final collaboration between Clark Gable and Lana Turner. They had previously worked together on 1941's Honky Tonk, 1942's Somewhere I'll Find You, and 1948's Homecoming. So it actually made a lot of sense to pair them up for this movie because audiences had a relationship to the two of them on screen, kind of like a Tom Hanks, Meg Ryan kind of thing. And
Mm.
so that's a lot of what this movie was sold on. You know, you look at the poster, both of them are very prominently featured next to each other.
And well, and then there's the other chap as well on the poster. This is really selling the stars more than the film,
Yeah, but even when you look at that poster, Victor Mature is a tiny little postage stamp at the bottom looking up at the two of them.
which I'm not sure should be the order.
Yeah, well, that's a very, very good point that we'll dive into in just a moment. So this movie, I don't, the financial information that's listed for this one, I don't have the most faith in, and I'll
Mm.
tell you why. So they list the budget as 1.6 million, with the gross being 4.1 million, which is, that's earning back on your
Sounds pretty good.
budget. But if you read any like actually proper source on this film, they all say it was a box office disappointment. And that does not indicate to me that it was that successful in terms of its budget.
But maybe Clark Gable films were just making money hand over foot, and this didn't. It just made okay money, and so for them, that's a disappointment. Like if you get a fire at the big guns like Clark Gable and Lana Turner, you want some return. No.
Maybe if we were to look at the box office receipts on their previous collaborations that they had, but also when you've got Clark Gable, who done Gone with the Wind like 15 years earlier, in comparison to something like that, yeah, this is pebbles.
That sounds like homework that someone else listening can do instead of me.
Sounds good. Sounds good. The top three for the year of 1954. Number one, White Christmas. Number two, The Caine Mutiny with Humphrey Bogart, which is a great film.
Mm-hmm.
And number three, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Disney film starring James Mason and Kirk Douglas.
It's just like the who's who of male lead actors this year.
It is, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I thought about James Mason a lot whilst watching this film
Who would you have cast him as?
in Clark Gable's role.
Yeah. I could see
I
it.
just feel like he's sort of built for that.
Yeah. Yeah, although Clark Gable has more of the romantic lead vibes than James Mason did.
Wow. You tell that to my loins.
And the final note on this one I've got, this was the final MGM film for Clark Gable, who would move on. He'd been with MGM for quite a while, but would go and do 2 films with Fox and then kind of bounce around. And probably the best of his post-Betrayed films is 1958's Run Silent, Run Deep, which was a submarine drama for United Artists. That's a great film. And that's in 58. He dies in 1960 of a coronary thrombosis.
It's interesting that you define Clark Gable's filmography as pre and post Betrayed. I didn't know that was what like Clark Gable's scholars did it as, but now I know.
Well, you know, the MGM years were for him the big period because that's the whole Gone with the Wind and then all the films that followed. And then you get this kind of bouncing around as more of an independent talent later on. And he didn't have as many great films to his name. He really just has, I think, Run Silent, Run Deep.
So from now on, anything after Betrayed is PB and before is BB.
Yes.
There we go.
That's
we go.
right.
That folks, film scholars out there, you now have your Clark Gable categorization, courtesy of us. Congratulations. Was it worth it?
And it's like, yeah, kind of notable that you have like 2 stars, particularly Lana Turner and Clark Gable, and this is kind of like getting to kind of the end of their like the real primo movie star MGM stars kind
their
of
reign,
period,
as it
like,
were.
Yeah. And like both of them would have kind of rocky years to come because Clark Gable obviously would die shortly after, not many years later down the road.
That's pretty rocky.
That's pretty
as
bad.
Far as it goes. Yeah.
And Lana Turner would have a really, really turbulent personal life that would get a lot of headlines in the years to come because she wound up, I think maybe like 2 years after this movie, dating a gangster named Johnny Stompanato. And it would be he's a gangster, very abusive relationship. And it would end when her teenage daughter stabbed him to death.
Jeez.
And it would lead to like a court case that would be, you know, just like headline grabbing. It was a big deal. But like Lana Turner had a very, very difficult and tumultuous few years ahead of her when she's shooting Betrayed. So it's kind of interesting that you have these 2 megastars of their era. And it's kind of at this point that things are not going to go so great in the next couple years.
Well, it's their PB.
That's right. Yeah, for them, very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. That's it's an interesting sort of delineation in their careers. This is perhaps the beginning of the end for both.
Yeah, like Lana Turner's going to work for a long time to come, but like the heights of Lana Turner mania are kind of in the years before Betrayed.
Well, there's a difference between being a working actor and being a star.
Yeah, definitely.
So she goes on for years and years and years to do stuff, but is she ever reaching the heights of where she was? By the sounds of it, no.
No. I mean, let's also look at it as she's an quote unquote aging actress in the 1950s and 60s Hollywood, right? So
yeah, for sure. But hey, that's the magic of going back to these films years later. We can enjoy these people at the height or, you know, the beginning of their twilight.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, okay. That was the behind the scenes of Betrayed. Let's coordinate our cockroaches and get down to this film. Now, you're more familiar with the work of Clark Gable and the work of Lana Turner and some of the cast, apart from those 2. So I'd like to hear from you first, Cam. How did you find the synergy of all these people coming together and making a spy film?
Well, Scott,
that's off to a good start.
The thing about Betrayed is this is the type of movie that you can sit me down in front of and I'm going to enjoy watching it.
Sure.
Because it is a 1950s MGM film. It's big. It's colorful. It's got huge stars. So, like, is this movie great? No, it isn't. But what kind of kept me going was just the movie star wattage and just the vibes of like this time period. It's a time period I very much love revisiting films from. But that said, I think this movie has a lot of problems. I think in terms of like a spy story, I mentioned Notorious earlier, and you have a Notorious poster behind your very head as I'm talking to you at this moment. And the thing about it is, I don't really know who this movie's about.
Yeah.
Because Clark Gable is your star, ostensibly, vanishes for great stretches.
I mean, as far as Sophia Loren was your star in Operation Crossbow.
Well, a little more so than that, but Clark Gable's kind of your setup, but then kind of vanishes. And the way they are kind of framing the movie is more about Lana Turner.
Yeah.
But the problem is, if you're going to create imagine the movie Notorious, people who've seen Notorious and maybe didn't watch Betrayed, I don't know. But like, imagine if you made Notorious with Ingrid Bergman being sent in to spy and you had no idea what she was doing the whole movie.
Yeah.
And you just had characters saying, we think she might be bad. We think she might be a traitor. But you have no evidence one way or the other because the movie is obscuring everything that's going on. So you start to hold the characters in suspicion. And I found that very frustrating because the way they're framing it is sending the Lana Turner character to like spy school to train as an agent. And I would like to know what she's specifically doing as an agent. And they're not giving me that. And so a lot of it becomes more of a romantic melodrama. And in that sense, the age differences are a little creaky when you watch the movie now. But like I was kind of just like swept up in just the overall atmosphere of the movie. When it was over, I really, more so than a lot of them, usually when I watch these movies for this show, I have a pretty clear sense as I'm watching the movie, what's holding together. This was one where when I finished it, I was like, I mostly enjoyed my 2 hours watching this movie, but this movie has a lot of problems. And so I was kind of having to sit there and break them down because it was very clear to me that like it didn't ultimately satisfy me in terms of like storytelling. It was more so just this time period.
Well, I don't want to start my review by praising Notorious because everyone knows I love that film.
Yeah.
Like that, as you said, is literally there is a poster hung on my wall behind me of Notorious. But if you're going to do the Notorious story, do it well. And one of the things that film does well is it has the romantic melodrama, as you mentioned. Ingrid Bergman's character, reignites a flame with Claude Rains as a way of spying on his and his friends' activities. You have that mission set up, and then you have the romance. But percolating under the romance is the tension of the fact she's on a mission and she is fooling him the whole time. None of that's here in this film. You don't know what she's doing. And so it's harder to get particularly invested in the melodrama because there's no real tension behind anything. And that tension is one of the things that I had trouble with in this film, and the lack thereof. It really felt like a hangout with your stars.
Yeah.
It is trying to have like moments of ratcheted tension, and there are some pretty successful action scenes that do give us some tense moments. There's an attack on a Nazi base where Lana Turner is performing.
Yeah.
And she has to hide behind the door, and it's stormed by people, and she almost gets shot, and she's saved by our boy in a necktie, a neckerchief, which we'll get into, but the scarf. But, I think overall, and I suppose I'll dovetail that into what I think about it, I really wanted to like this film because it starts off so cool. You get this like hidden base in rural England, and you get in these two quirky dudes that are actually from reshoots. These are all inserted characters into the film. They weren't actually part of the original script, and they go down into this base in this elevator that drops down. I'm like,
wasn't that crazy?
Whoa. I was like, what is this? This is so cool.
And it's set, like, as they say, in a small agricultural school, and that's like kind of like the front. I'm like, oh, that's very like spy-y. That's cool.
Yeah, but like kind of like funky, kind of quirky spy stuff. Like you'd see Bond do this stuff 10 years later.
Yeah.
But they're doing it in the 50s. My mind was blown for a moment. You had like the hidden phone and the lift going down to this underground base. I was like, yes, sign me up. And then you have Clark Gable and this like rescue where, his resistance fighters come in and save the day. But from that moment on, I'm on rocky ground. Because not only do we have a score that wants me to consider making myself deaf.
Wait, are you talking about like the music that plays?
The jingle jangle music that plays whenever the resistance is on screen? Yes.
I was so down with that. It reminded me of the Pinocchio ride in Disneyland. I was like, sign me up. I am living the dream.
I will try and get Cam to insert a moment of this music into this episode. It is so ear-piercingly annoying.
Yeah.
And they play the same tune on repeat at least 10 times during the film.
Accurate.
That's a small issue.
Hold on. We need to actually, like, you know the opening gun barrel of Bond where he's walking across? We need to do that, but score it to that music.
I will cut that together for you.
That would be absolutely incredible.
If you can isolate the audio of that and send it to me, I'll do the Bond thing for you.
Okay. Yeah.
That's your mission. There you go. But for me, as I said, I really wanted to enjoy this film, but I had trouble finding anyone to latch on to as a protagonist, because one thing this film does, and I think a lot of spy films do it, usually unsuccessfully, is this whole, like, nothing is as it seems. You can't trust anyone. The film makes a point of making every single lead character's allegiances shady. At the beginning of the film, Clark Gable's character is approached by the Nazi spy master to become a double agent, and you never really get an answer to that question, so that he has a question mark over him for the rest of the film. Lana Turner's allegiances are called in about halfway through the film. And then the Scarf, the other major character in the film, played by Victor Mature, is also, his allegiances are questioned. And ultimately, spoiler mark here, he's found out to be the double agent of the batch. I suppose I did already spoil that earlier. And so, like, there's no one to root for. And I can hear the argument against that is, okay, spying is a moral gray area. It shouldn't all be white hat, black hat stuff. But you do need a champion, even in the murkiest and greyest of films. You need someone that you can latch on to, be like, okay, he is the light, she is the light, they are the light that can carry me through this film. And Clark Gable, isn't it? Lana Turner, isn't it? And the other chap whose name I keep forgetting, I'm just going to call him the Scarf, is also not it. Victor Mature. So I'm sat there going, okay, I'm just watching these three actors act, which is fine. And there's a lot of money behind this film, and there's some great action sequences, some great stunt work going on. I'm pretty sure the guys who play Nazis in this film went on to play stormtroopers later, because these people know how to take bullets and fall down.
That's very accurate, yes.
Yeah, some great stuff there. And there's plenty of things for me to point out as stuff I liked, but I found no one to latch onto. And I mentioned the lack of tension and a lack of pace. I find later on, about the hour mark of this film, it just stops trying to be propulsive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more just about this melodrama of the romance and sort of a back and forth between all these different lead characters. So you can't centralize and ground yourself into one person, and you're just left watching this film for an hour and 45 minutes. As I say, it was a pleasant experience. I watched it twice without moaning too much, but it felt like they left so much on the table.
I wonder, because we're talking about how there's, like, no one to kind of follow, because the movie's set up with Clark Gable as the star. He vanishes once Lana Turner goes into the field, and we spend most of the time with her.
Uh-huh.
And then you kind of get this, like, this love triangle with, the romance between Clark Gable and Lana Turner is set up earlier, out of nowhere, frankly, I thought. But then when she's in the field, there's a little more of a romance between her and Victor Mature. So I wonder if, like, because by the end, Lana Turner's going to disappear, and then Clark Gable's going to basically come back into the movie and take it over for the final third. So you have no, like, main protagonist carrying you through the entire movie, and I wonder if they just wanted audiences to be compelled by the romance between Clark Gable and Lana Turner, who they've seen in previous movies, they have a relationship with, and they want that to be what the audience is the most invested in, the kind of preserving of their love affair through this film.
I can understand that as a motive for how they did this, but I don't think it's a successful one.
No, I think the romance comes completely out of nowhere. Like, when I was watching, and maybe this is kind of like moving into likes, and we'll bounce around, I'm sure, a bit, but I really enjoy the earlier sections of this movie where Lana Turner is brought in to do this job where she's going to pose as this, like, Dutch collaborator with the Nazis, like, who's a teacher, and they're bringing her in, and they're talking about her background, how she's someone who was married to someone that was like an industrialist. She has kind of this shady story where she was kind of mingling with black market types, things like that. And you have Clark Gable basically, like, breaking her down in a room and like questioning her and being like this kind of tough talking spy like mentor.
Hmm.
And I was like, this is the kind of stuff that like I am here for.
Yep.
It is tense. Clark Gable was very good at sniping at people. That was one of his specialties. You can see it in Gone with the Wind. It happened one night when Clark Gable talked tough. That man talked tough on screen. And that's the stuff where I'm like, oh, this is alive. And he's sitting there and playing, doing the piano test, like playing music and making her say what the songs are. I'm like, okay, I am totally down for like Lana Turner going to work with him. And we see her going to spy school and, doing like the parachuting and all that, which goes horribly wrong. And that the mission is in jeopardy and she's begging for the mission. He doesn't want to give it to her. Like there's tension there. And I'm like, oh, this is great. But then they out of just like nowhere, like throw in this, like, now we're in love with each other. And I'm like, no, that's not what's interesting about this relationship. And it's 1950s. It's MGM. Of course, there's going to be a romance with two big stars. Like there's no way out of that. But it's the kind of thing where when you watch the movie now, you're like, this romance makes absolutely no sense. And so, like, don't ask me to invest in this. And when I see her with, like, Victor Mature later, I could care less if she goes off with Victor Mature. Why not? He seems about as good as the other guy in terms of being a romantic interest. So, like, who cares? Whereas I feel like I should want that spark between her and Clark Gable, if you're going to have a romance, to be so strong that I feel threatened by it. Like, I'm like, when Victor Mature starts moving in, I'm like, no. I want to see my two stars together. And I never felt like that the whole movie.
Well, the gold standard would be having that romance spark early on in the film. So when they're separated, you want them to be reunited. Because there's a scene later on where Clark Gable comes back after some of Holland is captured from the Nazis. And they have they reunite, I should say. And, she's genuinely quite joyous about this happening. But me watching it, like, I had the dullest looking face you could imagine. I just didn't care.
The age differences are a problem for me, too.
Okay. I mean, I'm sort of used to that in this era, though. That just seems to happen when I watch films of the 50s and 40s.
It is part of this era, I agree. But, like, sometimes you actually have chemistry.
Sure.
Like, that comes across. Whereas, like, in this movie, he just looks like her father.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is just weird. He seems, like, kind of, grumpy. And you don't have that kind of, like, like, Clark Gable could be this very, like, believable romantic interest in a lot of movies. Like that was his specialty. He was like known as like, one of the great lovers of Hollywood. When you put him in a movie, in a romantic film, it worked. And this one, I just didn't feel like it worked. He seemed like very curmudgeon-y and angry. And she was coming from like this place of real vulnerability. And you want to see more of a connection there that just really wasn't happening. And I do wonder in that alternate timeline, like how Gregory Peck would play into this. If it would be a little more believable, if they're like closer in age almost.
That could have lended some credibility to the romance. I'm just not sure the spark was there on the day with them. Like, you tell me they've done stuff in the past and it's worked. Great, that's dandy. But I don't have that context.
No, and those movies, I haven't seen the 3 films they did previously, but like they probably, I'm gonna assume, are more invested in the romance than this movie is.
Well, they'd probably spend more time with it.
Yeah.
This film is doing other stuff like building up the threat, building up the scarf, all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about some more likes. I've definitely got a few to sprinkle in, and I've just got to talk about it. The scarf.
The scarf itself, or the character of the scarf?
The character of the scarf, played by Victor Mature. I'll remember his name this time. He is the third build in this film. He is Han Solo before Han Solo ever Han Soloed.
Yeah.
He is the rogue. Like, he is the prototype of the rogue. And I am for it. Every single scene in this film is joyous when he turns up. There's a moment I mentioned earlier where Lana Turner's character is sort of captured while she's performing for the Nazis, and she's having a gun pointed at her by some of the Dutch resistance fighters, and that jingle jangle carnival music is playing, and I want to put pencils in my ears. And then the scarf comes bounding through the window with a smile on his face, basically smacks her on the butt, punches her in the face, knocks her out, and then jumps back out the window. And I'm like, gee, what a guy.
Yeah, that one scene doesn't age great. But yeah, like he has like a kind of like swashbuckling daring do to him.
Yeah.
That you're like, this guy is bringing energy. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of fun. And I like the very like flamboyant yellow scarf around his neck that he always wears. They at a certain point like talk about how he only attacks in moonlight, and I'm like, what a weird detail. Like they're giving me more interesting little nuggets of stuff around the scarf than any other character in the movie. And like Victor Mature as an actor, I've seen a number of his films, and he's someone who can either be incredibly wooden or like really, really great. And I think of, they mentioned My Darling Clementine in the synopsis that you read, and that is a take on kind of the Tombstone story that's been remade many times, you know, the Wyatt Earp story.
Mm-hmm.
He's very good there as Doc Holliday. And he was also very good in a movie called Kiss of Death, where it was a noir film that was remade in the 90s with Nick Cage and David Caruso.
Right.
But like the original is fantastic. But he could also be like just like a block of wood. I think of like Samson and Delilah, where he played Samson opposite Hedy Lamar's Delilah. And you're just like, oh boy, this guy is just like kind of like hunk that they've put on screen, and he doesn't have a lot else to offer. So it's interesting when he is really clicking with the material, and I think he is here.
He absolutely is. He is oozing machismo. Like I could watch him for hours. And beginning of this year, we took a deep dive into the mystery man of the Balkans, Jan Tartu.
Yeah.
And I never quite got over Tartu. I always thought he was going to be one of the ones that's going to go down in the annals of Spy Hard's history. But I didn't think in any stretch of the imagination that in 2024 I would have someone who could go toe-to-toe with Tartu, and that is the Scarf. They are both chock full of charisma, and they grab your attention as soon as both of them are on screen.
I loved that early attack he has where they're coming in that like little boat across like this peaceful looking water in Holland,
Mm-hmm.
and they then like just kick off this whole assault on this Nazi base. And I'm like,
Yeah.
this is fantastic. And so much of the movie is people talking about the missions that the Scarf is on, and I'm like, maybe you guys made the wrong movie. Maybe like this movie should have been about someone like the Scarf embarking on missions, because that would have been something else. And like I'll take the teases I got, because every time they show Scarf kind of action scenes, I'm totally like, I'm down for it. But they keep teasing other ones, and I'm like, oh man, I would have liked to have seen that. I would have liked to seen that. And while we're talking about stuff I love about the Scarf, the Freudian aspects of this character are amazing.
They love it, don't they? Yeah, the mother stuff.
Oh, there's so much depth. All the stuff with the mother is so interesting, where he's like really waxing poetic about his mother's hair and running his hands through her hair when he was younger, and how it's silky and smooth, much like Lana Turner's, and how he's falling in love with Lana Turner because she reminds him of his mother. And I'm like, oh, perfect. Like, this is the kind of character quirk that like the other people don't have in this movie. Like, give me this kind of interesting, I guess in some ways supporting character, or at least co-lead, and I'm like, this is like bringing this movie to life. And we have like details where it's like we find out that him and his men like slit a woman's throat and then cut her hair off.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you know, obviously they would cut the hair off people who were collaborators in this time,
Sure.
German collaborators,
Yeah.
and like, or suspected even. And we find that out, so there's like a real darkness to what the Scarf is doing with him and his men.
Mm-hmm.
So there's like a danger built in. But then the way you find out later, that's what happened to his own mother, was that they cut her hair off. And I'm like, they just like tied the bow on this Freudian package so beautifully that like that's the character that's going to stick with me, because the movie seems to care the most about making him interesting.
Well, very early on, you get an idea of the man. You speak about that Nazi assault on the base where Clark Gable is currently captured. He runs into the room shooting a pistol, and then picks up Clark Gable with one hand, and then with the other hand picks up a whiskey bottle, flips it in the air and catches it, and then walks out casually.
Yeah.
This is the kind of guy I want to follow into battle, you would think. But then it drops in some stuff like this, where he says, you wouldn't get away with this stuff out of wartime, but during war, I'm celebrated for killing people. And you're like, oh, that's dark. This guy's got some problems.
Yeah. And he lives in a windmill.
Like, it's just a quirky little character, isn't it? Like, I just want more Scarf. And so, I remarked about the Mystery Man of the Balkans. Now, unfortunately, I checked Betrayed's taglines to see if it had its own version. It didn't. So I've come up with my own title for the Scarf.
Okay.
The Howling Hunk of Holland.
I was trying to come up with one in my own head, and I can't top that. There's nothing I could ever say that'll top that.
That's it. The howling hunk of Holland. This is what Betrayed will be remembered for.
I was trying to come up with a windmill term, but no, I got nothing.
No. Triple H is where it's going to stay. But do you have a like you want to bring up?
Well, I mean, like the scarf is a huge part of it and everything that's interesting with that character. But honestly, like the location work of this movie brought so much. And Freddie Young shooting this movie, it's not the most beautiful looking MGM movie. Like I think honestly that has more to do with the prints that are available to watch.
Sure.
I would be very interested in how this movie would look on the big screen because I know they like tried to make a lot of the shots look like paintings, like Dutch paintings. And even if the print that is available for streaming isn't the world's greatest, you can definitely feel the effort and like this determination to make Holland look very unique on screen for audiences, because this is still the era where movies are more like travelogues and they want you to feel kind of the atmosphere when they do go to a place like this. And it really comes across that effort. Like every time it would show like a field or a windmill or like a tranquil lake, I was like, this has an energy and an atmosphere to it that we don't see in most spy movies.
Yeah.
And it sometimes is very easy to be just dismissive. Oh, yeah. I liked when they went to the Bahamas. That was great. But like when you watch a spy movie that really does have a genuine atmosphere coming from a place that we don't see explored over and over again in film, it really does make a difference. And that's why I'm maybe a little more forgiving of the score, because it does have that kind of like Dutch kind of musical cue to it that it is kind of grating, but at the same time, it's so specific to that time and place that like it gives it, it gives it a little bit of an energy.
I give credit to them for figuring out a way of putting Holland across that isn't a joke or a caricature.
Yeah.
And they've clearly been in a windmill and seen how cramped those things can be, and they design a set where they use it quite a few times in the film that feels claustrophobic. And it feels like you are inside of that windmill and people are living in there and there is a resistance force based within it.
Yeah.
They've gone to Holland and seen inside a windmill. Like there is little touches that I feel that sort of go the extra mile.
And I will say they tried to do some accents. I don't know that Victor Mature's was great, but he tried.
Did he?
He tried a little bit. It was a little bit of a Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. I don't think anyone ever hired Victor Mature to do accents, but you could tell they tried a little bit, and it was there.
Okay, I'll take your word for it there. The only other thing I want to bring up with likes, and I'll throw it back to you for any final ones, is, and I mentioned it earlier, but the sort of campy, goofy elements of the film. When it did do it, I quite enjoyed it. I mentioned the elevator, which I think was a great moment, quite subversive. You didn't see it coming in the film. And then briefly after that, you find out that they are using a horse-drawn cart as a Morse code sending device by tapping the foot on the footrest, and that's just not something I've seen before.
No, that was actually really interesting as well. Like, again, this movie, that's why, when it was over, I really had to sit with it and be like, well, this movie did things I liked, and it was something that kept me engaged, but it has issues that are dragging it down in my mind. And, like, what do I genuinely think of this movie? And some other things I liked. I thought that O.E. Hasse, if that's correct in terms of pronunciation, who played Colonel Helmut Dietrich, who's like this Nazi officer that has a lot of a back and forth dialogue with Clark Gable's character. I thought he was a fantastic little supporting character who gets brought in on the mission at a certain point, and like was an interesting kind of character, because usually when you see Nazis in movies around World War II or in the years that follow, they don't tend to be portrayed in a way where they would be people that would have any sort of relationship with your lead. They would be more like boo-hiss villains. And it was interesting the way that character was someone who was very aware of the spy world.
Yeah.
And would talk about how like the greatest achievement was to become a double agent, and that you don't have a character, you only assume one. Like, it was someone who spoke about kind of the nature of being a spy. So I did enjoy that character quite a bit. I was a little confused at what happened to him ultimately by the end of the movie, but every time he showed up, I was like, this character definitely has some spark to him. And I thought Lana Turner was actually very good in this movie in the early sections.
Yep.
And she showed up ready to play in this movie. Like, Lana Turner was a great actress and is great with like the material she's given, but you can see that the movie's working against her, but I don't walk away from this movie thinking, that Lana Turner was not giving it her all.
Going back to your first topic of Dietrich, played by O.E. Hasse, I believe, or Haas.
Yeah.
One of the two. I really loved that. And I felt like whoever wrote his dialogue had obviously read a lot of spy novels.
Yeah, you didn't get the sense that this is a movie just kind of like making up a spy thing because why not? It definitely seemed like it
had something to say.
Written by, two writers, who had something to say about spycraft at a time where spy mania hasn't kicked in. This is the 50s. Yeah. That's the 60s. And they were talking about spycraft in a way that was interesting.
Yeah, there's a really cool mirroring effect in this film through the Dietrich character. Early on in the film, Dietrich, as part of the Nazis, has captured Clark Gable's character and says, do you want to be a double agent for us and work for the Nazis and continue your chosen profession?
Yeah.
And later on, Clark Gable's character offers Dietrich the same thing, and Dietrich helps him get and sort of smuggle out the scarf at the end of the film. And, there's just like lines, mirroring it at the end is a nice touch. But just that idea of whoever was writing this had a good idea about spycraft and has obviously read up on it. And it wasn't just someone going like, what are the tropes of spies? Okay, double agent. Yeah, I'll put in a twist here, yada, yada, yada. They got it. They got it.
Yeah. And like the 60s would create more of the spy template. Like,
sure.
When you go through there, once Bond comes around and a lot of the movies that follow, there's like a template to these kind of movies. Mm-hmm. This feels like more of that still experimental period where it's like they're interested in spies. Hitchcock's been doing spy films for a couple decades at this point when this movie comes out. But they aren't... Hitchcock has his own personal formula.
Yeah.
You can see that they're just experimenting with what a spy story could be. In this movie, by kind of tying it up in this Hollywood melodrama film, is still finding ways to insert interesting commentary.
Yeah. Well, I think it's digging down into what the sort of metatextual conversation about what spies are. And that comment about us all playing characters and things like that was all quite interesting. It's actually more interesting than this film deserves. It's quite heady.
Yeah.
For a spy. I would expect conversation and dialogue like that in a John le Carré adaptation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The only other thing I wanted to bring up in terms of likes is actually agree with you about Lana Turner. I think she's really good at the start. I think the training stuff is really interesting and seeing the spy school. That's all nice little touches. I agree it all falls apart later on when the whole love story happens, but I didn't expect Lana Turner to fall out of an airplane and her parachute fail to open.
No, I didn't see that at all. I also really like the scene where she is performing at the Nazi bar or tavern.
Yeah.
And she's dubbed over, so it's not her singing voice, but I was getting almost like the vibes of Fabulous Baker Boys with Michelle Pfeiffer, or right. You mentioned Black Book earlier. It had that kind of energy, and Lana Turner plays it to the hilt, and you can understand how she can kind of work her way through. She's convincing in those early sections as someone who would be a good asset as a spy. And this character desperately wants to be a spy and is fighting to have her mission. And at a certain point, you're like, just let us see this woman's mission.
Yeah.
That's what's frustrating.
Well, that's and sorry to mention Notorious again, but that's one of the reasons Ingrid Bergman's character works so well in Notorious, because she is resistant.
Yeah.
To doing this work. She doesn't want to be a spy. It isn't her chosen profession, to use the term this film uses. And early on, you get the idea that it isn't really what she wants to do either. But pretty quickly, she falls in line. And I would say that's where they sort of drop the ball.
The notable thing about Notorious, though, too, is that, it's very much her story. And Cary Grant is on the outside. And, this movie shifts it back and forth, which mixes up ultimately the formula.
Yeah, although I don't know if... would it be Claude Rains or would it be Cary Grant that's the scarf of Notorious?
I don't know that I can see Claude Rains wearing a flamboyant yellow scarf in Notorious.
I could definitely see Cary Grant wearing one. In fact, I think he does in To Catch a Thief.
But wait a second.
Oh.
Wait a second.
Oh.
Claude Rains had the big mother issues, just like the scarf does here.
Right. So it's an unassuming scarf for Claude Rains, the acting challenge of a lifetime.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Red Alert Spy Hards, we are shaking things up over on the Patreon page.
That's right, we are launching an exclusive new show where we tackle the exploits of the small screen's greatest secret agents, like Jack Bauer, George Smiley, and beyond.
And don't forget, every month you also get 2 Agents in the Field episodes where we decode the adventures of your favorite spy actors in their biggest non-spy movies. But Cam, tell the people what we have coming up next.
Scott, it's been a joke since almost day one of this podcast, but we are finally unleashing Horse Hards. That's right, we are going to look at Slow Horses Season 1, based on the Mick Herron series. I'm very excited for this, and we are going to find out whether Season 1 is a yay or a nay.
So don't get left out in the cold. Help support your favorite spy movie podcast and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, let's get back to the spy jinx. All right, it's dislike time, folks. Let's betray betrayed. Cam, what have you got?
Well, it is that second half of the movie where we just kind of lose connections to the things we're interested in. Because Lana Turner, interesting in theory, but then they start to kind of water down what her journey is.
Mm-hmm.
Victor Mature, his stuff gets a little more kind of diluted as we move through the movie, and it becomes this whole who's the spy, who's not, and he's off screen for a lot of that.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I almost hate to say it, the dislike then hovers over Clark Gable and his character.
Yeah.
Because I just don't. As I said, I like him as the tough taskmaster, kind of spy mentor early in the movie. So Clark Gable's up for that kind of assignment. But when it turns into his character trying to root out this mole, it just isn't compelling enough.
No.
And he doesn't have anyone to bounce off of because Lana Wood is off screen at a certain point. She's not even factoring into the story at all. She doesn't show up until the very final moments of the movie. And so, who do you have? You have Clark Gable. You do get some, as we said, some solid stuff with Dietrich, that character. But it's a lot of him with Charles Larrabee, the British general or whatever, who is the most jovial spy dude I've ever seen in my life. He's just so happy.
And partially deaf, I think.
Oh, you think so?
Well, he keeps going, oh, sorry, did you say something? Oh, no, don't worry. Either that or he's constantly playing mind games. I can't figure out which one it is.
He's always smiling. He's always so happy. He's cancel the girl? Should we cancel the girl?
No one would be saying that sentence with a smile.
Well, he was smiling, though.
He was.
He was very jovial.
He is the ultimate spy master. He's always keeping you on your toes.
But he's also not a compelling character.
No.
He's a fun little supporting bit, but weirdly, the movie has him narrating sections of the film, and that's kind of who we're spending big chunks of Clark Gable's time with, is him bouncing off of Larrabee, which isn't as interesting or character-driven as the stuff we've seen with Victor Mature and Lana Wood. That becomes more of kind of the beating heart of the movie, because there's not a lot of beating hearts going on with the romance between Clark Gable and Lana Turner. So, it's her and Victor Mature where suddenly, my interest kicks in a little more. But then the movie's the carpet's pulled out from under me because I got to go hang out with Clark Gable for the last bit. And I don't know, I hate to, pick on the guy for being older, but there's an older energy to it, and that affects the pace. It doesn't have, as you said, that kind of that kind of machismo that you're getting with Victor Mature, that kind of oomph to the movie. You lose all that, and that's where the movie just becomes a little more of, slog's a strong word, but it just doesn't have kind of the zest you hope for.
Well, it's not got a pep to it. It's almost as if I wrote down that Clark Gable just felt very passive in this film.
Yeah.
He wasn't a big agent for change. He was just sort of, he was pulling the strings and and dealing, sort of making some of the things happen, but he wasn't really in there with the action. He never really fires a gun. He never is really the action man of this film. That's all down to the scarf. Well, obviously, there is an age thing there, and he doesn't need to do that to prove his worth. And nor should anyone's worth be based on if they can shoot a gun or not. But it's interesting that he's meant to be your stud.
Yeah.
And he is completely usurped in that regard. But I think where I fall down on Clark Gable, in this film at least anyway, I can't speak to the rest of his work, is that one thing this film doesn't, even in the marketing, is, which of our 3 leads is going to be the double agent? Who could it be now? That's all well and good, but the film sets up very early that Clark Gable is the turncoat. Like that whole do you want to keep doing your profession? And he never gives the answer.
Yeah.
And that is the perfect seed to pay off later on. Instead, they do sow the seed for the scarf because you see the mother with the hair shaved off, and that sort of betrayal is there. It's not that they don't earn that moment, but I felt like the logical conclusion was to have Clark Gable as the baddie.
Yeah.
And that would have at least given him a bit of pep. And he's a sinister. He's twirling that very, very well formed mustache of his. But they don't do it. And so you're anyone paying a moderate amount of attention to this film would be questioning Clark Gable's loyalties in the last few throws of the film. But no one in the film is wise enough to point it out to him. No one's able to go wait, is it you? No, they just assume he's fine. And what I feel like, even if they didn't go that way and make him the baddie, no one even goes, but is Clark Gable the bad guy?
And he's almost too stoic in this movie to ever question it. Like, you can look at the other characters and go okay, Lana Turner's character, we know a bit about her backstory, and the way she can come across kind of obscured in this movie in terms of her motivations.
Mm-hmm.
You're I guess she could be bad potentially. And then the scarf, obviously, he easily could be, but Clark Gable is a statue of a man in this movie.
Yeah.
There's no chips in him. And so you never get the sense that he could be maybe corrupted. And it's interesting that Gregory Peck was their alternate, choice for that role, because Gregory Peck, while younger, is also someone who's very stoic and not someone who you would read a lot of ambiguity into.
Sure.
In these types of movies. So I guess they clearly got what they wanted in terms of the type of star, but I don't know that it does a lot for the energy of the movie. And, you do have that moment at the end where it's him mano a mano with Victor Mature, and he does shoot, Oh,
he does shoot a gun. You're right.
He does.
At the end, he does fire a gun once.
But my takeaway was not look at Clark Gable, saving the day or looking like a badass at the end or something.
Mm.
Victor Mature goes out throwing a knife at him and diving out a window, and I'm once again, he just stole the scene.
Yeah, you'd think someone with Clark Gable's pedigree would be able to sell it, and I just don't think he does. I don't know whether he's not interested in or engaged in the material, or it was just a case of miscast.
Or this was his final MGM film. Was he just done?
Yeah. It's entirely possible, and it's a real shame, because I said it at the beginning on my sort of top-line thoughts. There's a good idea here.
Yeah.
And if you're going to steal a bunch of ideas from Notorious, I mean, if we so far on this show, we've had 2 Notorious knockoffs. I think I would rate this one under Mission Impossible 2.
It's tough, because I think Mission Impossible 2, the highs are so much higher than anything in Betrayed. But if I'm to look at it from a character standpoint and just as a drama, I think this might be better as a drama than Mission Impossible 2.
That's fair. I mean, I'll throw it out to the listeners. What do you think is better, Betrayed or Mission Impossible 2? That is a question that has never been asked in the history of film criticism.
I will say this. I am more likely to watch Mission Impossible 2 in the future several times than I am to watch Betrayed again.
But if this film had more of that sort of quirky spy building at the beginning, elements like that, or the Morse code tapping thing, I think I would have actually been more engaged in the latter half of the film if they had more just weirdness to it, embraced the craziness of being a spy. Yeah. But they don't do it. Those ideas then feel like they were just thrown in because they don't have more of that later on.
Right. I wonder too, there's that Wikipedia bit about Kirk Douglas being up for the lead. Kirk Douglas could play very dark characters a lot of time. He bounced between. He could be very upstanding people. I think of Paths of Glory, the Stanley Kubrick film, which he's incredible in. But then he would also do something like Ace in the Hole, where he's a very dark, kind of repellent character. And I wonder if having that sort of ambiguity with a Kirk Douglas performance would work, for me at least, a little bit better than what Clark Gable's doing.
Maybe that is the case, but I would also like the characters in the film to lean into the ambiguity of it all. Because no one really questions Clark Gable.
No, there's not a single moment where he's under the microscope. And I think that would have worked well, especially given that he has this relationship with the Dietrich character.
Yeah.
But Larrabee, that was kind of why I pointed out, Larrabee is a character who's fun, but he's more exposition dude than anything. He's not someone who, imagine if he was turning the screws on Clark Gable. That would add some tension.
Well, I was going to suggest that, and you could still do it in his jovial way, like, "Oh, don't worry, old boy, we'll get you through this. I'm sure all these allegations are nothing. Have a cigarette." But at the same time, he's actually interrogating him with the things that he's saying, and you can hear you can see the wheels turning, and you can feel the pressure, a little bit like a No Way Out situation where he has to prove himself innocent whilst catching the bad guy simultaneously, that sort of thing going on. But they don't do it, and I think that's a real waste. And I don't have much else to add in the sort of dislike department, except I think this film could be served by being a bit shorter.
Sure.
I think there's a lot of just toing and throwing, especially with Lana Turner's character, that if you're not interested in digging into her any further, and she's just going to turn into, a damsel in distress, then just cut some of it out.
Which is interesting because this movie is 6 minutes longer than Notorious.
Right.
And I don't think you would ever say Notorious doesn't move.
No.
And so it is like a real pacing issue. And I think it is the fact that with Notorious, you're able to really hook into your interest in the characters.
Mm-hmm.
And this movie kind of holds you at arm's length a lot of the time.
Yeah, I agree. But I think before we get to the knock list, any final notes? Cam, have you got anything for us?
Yeah, I've got a few things. There's a part early on when they have that attack on the Nazi base where there's a dude holding a scythe who throws it away and pulls out a gun. And I was like, that is the most awesome thing I maybe have ever seen. And I rewound that moment 5 times because it's so quick that I was like, did I just see a guy throw a scythe to the, off screen? And I did, but it's like blink and you'll miss it. It's so cool.
That is a great moment. And also moments afterwards, you've got the scarf diving into a window and immediately kissing Lana Turner. That's a feat as well.
Yeah.
But that scythe moment reminded me a lot of Q in, I think, License to Kill, where he has the broom.
Okay. Oh, yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, it turns it into a microphone or whatever it was. It gave me that sort of vibe. But yeah, and I said it earlier, there are some actually really great action sequences in this.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of bodies thrown at the screen, a lot of people being shot at, and a lot of stunts going on in the background. People just diving and throwing themselves all over the place to have a fun scene. Lots of pyrotechnics and pretend grenades and things like that. They really do sort of sell the sense of this is a piece of the world that's at war.
Well, and Victor Mature's death scene is staged really well.
Yeah.
Where a lot of movies of this time period could play death scenes as rather quick and perhaps forgettable. You got to go forward a few years before they give really extravagant death scenes to villain characters. But this one is pretty darn good, where he's shot in the back, goes out the window, and then gets shot twice more when he hits the ground. I thought that was a pretty memorable ending to that character.
And then he gets shot, and you pan up, and you have the British soldiers coming in there singing "Bless 'Em All," and Lana Turner turns up, and it's a happy ending. I just think that's a nice way to wrap up the story.
Yeah, less satisfying in terms of a wrap up, which is my other note, is what goes on with Dietrich and Clark Gable when they're getting on the plane, and Dietrich goes to run away, and then they have a fist fight. That's shot from a long ways away, which makes me think there was obvious stunt doubles going on there. But I was completely baffled as to what was going on. They do explain it, but even still, I was like, that's not the most satisfying.
Well, you mentioned Allied earlier. It reminded me a lot of the end of that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Where they're having the fight outside the bomber. I just found that quite interesting, a little connection there. But yeah, kind of hard to see the geography of that fight. And also 20 Nazi soldiers run up to the plane and just sort of watch it take off casually.
It's weird.
Not the best look. In terms of final notes on my end, I was going to ask about if Gable was miscast, who you would cast, but I think we've probably answered that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of other actors. I think maybe someone who was a similar age as Lana Turner, it would have had a completely different dynamic, and someone like a Kirk Douglas who had a little bit of edge to him, I think would maybe be a little more what I would have preferred.
Or potentially Gregory Peck.
He's a little too stoic, and that was our big problem with the chairman.
True.
Age-wise, yes, but yeah.
And I said I wasn't a big fan of the score. You seem to be more forgiving of Betrayed, but I just wanted to hear from you, and a casual question for all listening. What's the worst film score you've ever heard?
Oh my god. I mean, I'm sure it's probably some movie that was straight to video and had a very cheap Walmart orchestra score, that kind of thing. But
So we're talking Midnight in St. Petersburg then, yeah?
yeah, something like that. The one that jumps to mind though, and I'm not going to say it's the worst score I've ever heard, but it's probably the worst score I've heard for a movie we've tackled on this show, was
Sure.
The Wrecking Crew.
Right.
The score for The Wrecking Crew was like nails on a blackboard every time it kicked in. And it reminded me of, I've heard some Disney scores from like their 60s kind of period that are really obnoxious and annoying too. It reminded me of those.
Okay. I think that's probably a fair answer. My answer was actually going to be Midnight in St. Petersburg. It was so bad that we played a clip of it in the episode and then got demonetized on YouTube.
I have no memory of this whatsoever.
It's in the episode. Weirdly,
Is it really?
that was that little cue of music got that video taken down. So strange.
Oh, wow. I have no absolute memory of that Midnight in St. Petersburg. I remember the review, but I don't remember the score.
If my memory serves, it's just very dreary and overly dramatic, and it's kind of got like a little Russian flair to it, but not an interesting one.
Yeah.
And it's just a bit like, I would call it plinky plonky.
Well, there's so many of those budget scores you'll
Yeah.
see in cheaper movies that it's almost unfair because it's like, what were they working with in terms of what they were willing to pay for a score?
They literally had the trash can out the back, and that was it.
Exactly. Whereas
Yeah.
when you watch a movie that has a composer of note and the score is really bad, it's clearly a bad fit for the movie, that to me is more egregious.
Is that a pun? Composer of note?
I guess it is. I didn't mean to make a pun, but yeah, let's go with that.
Well, a perfect way to take us out and into the knock list, Cam. And to be fair, they all go out in the end, even the best of them. Betrayed. Is it making the knock list? What do you think?
No, it is not sitting next to Notorious on the knock list today. That's
I'd have to rip
yeah.
my poster off the wall.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah. And I will preface with this. This wasn't a bad film.
Mm-mm.
It was just executed badly.
It was frustrating,
Yeah.
which is something that in many ways is more rewarding in terms of conversation on the podcast. But
Sure.
When I finished the movie, that's why I spent so much time kind of very mixed emotions about it.
Yeah, and the knock list is meant to be the need to see official classics, the best of the best, the cream of the crop when it comes to spy movies. And I cannot say Betrayed is on that list wholeheartedly. But what I can say, if you're in that middle ground where you're not sort of watching every film every week, but you're more or less keeping up with the show, I would say try and make a little bit of time to watch Betrayed if you can find it, because I think it's got enough interesting elements to pay off its time, pay off the investment you make in watching those 2 hours, in just sort of thinking this is 1954 and they're doing things that the Bond mania and spy mania of the 60s would go on to do the following decade and pretend that they invented, but they didn't.
Also, the 1950s, Hitchcock aside, is kind of a weird period for spy movies.
Yeah.
And we've talked about Springfield Rifle, Big Jim McClane. These are kind of very strange studio attempts at spy storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And this one manages to get a little closer to what we would want from a spy film, but you can just tell that the 50s was a weird era for the genre, and it's kind of why this particular decade is so interesting to me to talk about those movies on the show.
Yeah, and it's also just lacking in films.
Yeah.
Like on our list, I think it's the quietest decade.
There's a couple Hitchcock movies, but not a lot else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, North by Northwest comes out this decade.
Yeah, that and The Man Who Knew Too Much remake, yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go, folks. 2 no's, and as such, Betrayed is not making the knock list. The dossier on the film is complete and filed as classified. But as always, Mr. Smith, the question goes to you, sir. What are we talking about next week?
Well, we did some comparing between Betrayed and Mission Impossible 2. Well, next week we are going to go back to the world of the IMF and take on Mission Impossible 3 from 2006. I have a lot of memories of my theatrical experience with this one. I am looking forward to diving back into it. Any chance to talk about a Philip Seymour Hoffman performance is always gangbusters on Spy Hards.
Yeah, I remember this one being the film that people threw around as the savior of the Mission Impossible franchise. I haven't watched it in a long time, so I'm interested to go back to it and see what I think of it now, having seen a lot more of JJ's work since.
And also where Mission Impossible has gone since as well.
Yeah. Yeah, very true. So there you go, folks. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as we go back to the IMF and take a look at 2006's Mission Impossible 3. I've got a lot to say about this film, and I'm very curious to see what I think of it now, many years in the rear view mirror. And if you want to help support SpyHard, you can find out more about our Patreon over at patreon.com/SpyHard. So you can find a link in the show notes below. It's basically there to help keep the lights on here at SpyHard's HQ. Every single patron donor means a ton to us. We give you 2 to 3 bonus episodes every month as well. We cover non-spy movies and also take a look at spy stories from the small screen, so TV shows and TV movies. A lot to check out over there. And make sure you follow us discreetly, as always, on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next time, folks, Cam and I are off to spot some red-tailed chaffids at 5 in the morning.